Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here, as always, to tackle some really complex ideas and try to make them, well, understandable. We use the source materials directly to give you a solid, structured look at things.
And today, we're definitely jumping into the deep end. We're looking at maybe one of the most profound questions in theology, identity within the Godhead itself.
It's a big one. We're looking at sources that explore the relationship between what they call the first God and the second God. It's about infinite existence, creation, all of that.
It really centers on a paradox, doesn't it? This tension between eternal equality on one hand and then this temporary subordination, you could call it, on the other.
Exactly. So the big question, framing this whole deep dive today is this. Does the first God stay the Father and the second God stay the Son, even when they're both, eternally sustaining the infinite together?
Or, put another way, is Son an eternal name tag, an essential part of who the second God is?
Right. Or is it more like a role, something taken on for a specific purpose, maybe related to creation, to space-time?
That's precisely the core of it. We're diving into what's traditionally called Trinitarian theology, but specifically focusing on how identity and status seem to shift when the divine interacts with the created order.
With space-time, as the sources put it.
Yes, and we'll need to navigate some pretty dense terms. And crucially, there are two different theological viewpoints presented in our material about when this son title really applies.
Two competing views, okay.
And why the second God, despite being equal, has to become, well, the sources say smaller temporarily. It's all tied to the ultimate goal of creation itself. It's intricate stuff.
Okay, let's unpack this then. First things first, before we even get to the roles, Father, Son, the sources seem very quick to, draw a line. They put a hard stop on how much we humans can actually know.
That's the essential starting point, really. You can't talk about the infinite without first acknowledging our finite perspective.
So how do they define God?
The sources define the triune Godhead, the first, second, and third gods, as fundamentally spirit, existing entirely outside our reality in what they call the eternal infinite.
And that realm, the eternal infinite,
Yeah.
it's just completely beyond our frameworks, right?
Completely. Which leads directly to the next point. Created beings, which the sources call pijomo, we fundamentally cannot know how God sustains the infinite, or even how God exists in that state.
We just can't grasp it.
We only know what's been revealed, what God has chosen to communicate to us. We're limited to the revelation.
And it's not just an intellectual limit, is it? It's baked into our existence.
Exactly. Our entire being is bound by time. We live life second by second, minute by minute, and we're contained within space. We can't just pop out of it.
So logically, a created being can't exist before its own creation. We can't experience the time before time, so to speak.
Right. Our whole way of thinking, language, logic, cause and effect, it's all tied to this universe. It's the only toolkit we have.
So it's like trying to explain color to someone born blind, but on a cosmic scale. We lack the fundamental senses, the fundamental framework.
That's a good analogy. And this really underscores God's transcendence. The sources describe it in a way that's, well, quite stark.
How so?
They say God regards space-time, our entire universe, everything we know. Even the heaven of angels, the Wujino Jianzahano God regards all of it. Mashi am non giot kiorium. As if it doesn't exist.
Wow. Okay, hold on. As if it doesn't exist? Our reality. Everything.
That's the language used. It's a statement about the sheer scale difference. Our entire cosmic existence, which is everything to us, is, from the perspective of the eternal infinite God, apparently negligible.
That's hard to wrap your head around. It's not that God is dismissing us, maybe, but that the difference in reality is just that vast.
That seems to be the implication. It highlights the radical otherness of God, and the source then draws a logical conclusion from this.
Which is?
Well, if we, as finite beings, can't even fully grasp the dimensions and nature of this space-time reality that God essentially ignores...
And how could we possibly hope to understand the God who exists entirely outside of it and considers it nothing?
Exactly. It sets a boundary for theological inquiry. We can't expect exhaustive explanations.
Which makes sense why the sources then say that trying to explain the divine nature in detail, using human language, using manja, is, quote, completely impossible.
Right. Our words are grounded in our reality. Father, Son, Spirit, begotten, firstborn. These are all fundamentally analogies. They're finite terms pointing towards an infinite reality we can't fully map.
The sources even note that the Bible itself doesn't give us, the full technical schematics of God.
No, it gives us what we need to know. For salvation, for relationship, for understanding our place in the story, but not a complete metaphysical breakdown.
Okay, so we have to approach all this with a serious dose of humility. Understanding that the concepts we're about to discuss, equality, subordination, sonship, are pointers, not perfect descriptions.
That's crucial. Acknowledging the limits of our language actually helps us navigate the paradoxes. We see them not as contradictions in God, but as reflections of the limits of our created understanding, trying to grasp the uncreated.
Right, so starting from that place of unknowability, where do the sources go next? What can we know about the structure?
Well, while the how of God's infinite existence is unknowable, the sources do clarify the fundamental relationship within the Godhead.
Okay.
And the baseline is equality. The first, second, and third gods are defined as fundamentally equal, dongdong,
Equal in what sense?
in power, in divinity, in nature, and crucially, they all eternally sustain the infinite together. There's no original hierarchy, no inherent ranking in the absolute eternal sense. They are co-equal, co-eternal.
Okay, co-equal, co-eternal. But then we have the names. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Where did those come from?
Those arise in the context of manifestation. When God interacts with creation, with space-time, the sources say God manifests himself using these relational titles.
And we accept this framework simply because it's what has been revealed.
Yes, it's the structure given to us. But this is exactly where the tension, the paradox, really comes to the forefront.
Because we move from that absolute equality in the infinite
To a situation in space-time that looks like a mix of equality and subordination. It's complex.
How so? Lay out the conflict.
Okay, the sources are clear. The second God is equal to the first God. Eternally sustains the infinite, co-equal. However...
It's always a however with paradoxes.
Right. However, the sources also state that while the second God exists as a created being, a pijomo, in that specific state, he is described as smaller than the first God. The word used is jagushida.
Smaller. Okay, that's the core paradox right there. How can the eternally equal second God be simultaneously smaller than the first God? What does smaller even mean here?
It seems to mean functionally subordinate or operating within a defined, temporarily limited role within the created order. It's not a diminishment of his essential divine nature, but a change in his operational status for the sake of the mission.
And this becoming smaller, this entering the created state, it was voluntary.
Absolutely critical point. The sources emphasize the self-emptying, the kenosis. The phrase used is susurreal biushigo. He emptied himself. He voluntarily humbled himself to become a creature.
Why is the voluntary aspect so important?
Because, the sources argue, if this act had been required by a command from the first God, it wouldn't truly be humility. It would be obedience.
Okay. If I'm ordered to be humble, I'm just following orders.
Mm-hmm.
But if someone who is my equal chooses to take a lower position for a purpose.
That's a profound act of voluntary humility, and love, presumably. The choice is what gives the act its specific character and power within the theological framework presented.
So this subordination, this smaller status, it's tied specifically to the mission in space-time. It's not an eternal state.
Correct. It's purely functional and temporary. And even in that state, having taken on the form of a creature, the sources stress that the second God remains inherently greater than the entire universe. Manu Goda Kushida.
So there's still a hierarchy within creation. First God, transcendent. Second God, manifested as creature but perfect and above all else, and then the rest of creation below him.
Exactly. It's a purposeful positioning for the sake of the creative and redemptive plan. He's not becoming just any creature. He's becoming the perfect archetypal creature.
This idea of intentional, temporary reduction in status, it seems absolutely key to everything that follows.
It is, and it leads us right into the central divide within the source material we're looking at today. It all hinges on how you understand two specific titles given to the second God.
Titles that define his status.
Precisely. They seem to capture this duality we've been discussing, his eternal divine nature versus his assumed created status. Understanding the nuance between these two titles is essential before we can tackle the two competing theological viewpoints.
Okay, let's define them clearly. What's the first title?
The first is the only begotten Son. In the Korean terms provided in the source material, that's Oedokja or Doksangja.
Only begotten Son. What does that title signify?
It points directly to the second God as creator Chanjuju. It speaks of his inherent divinity, his unique relationship with the first God, eternally begotten, not made. It signifies equality, shared divine nature, existing before and outside of creation's timeline.
Like John 3.1 Sen, his only begotten Son. Or John 1.14, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father.
Exactly. Passages like those, and John 1.18 too. This title fundamentally defines his eternal nature as divine.
Okay, that's clear. Only begotten Son equals creator God, inherent divine nature. What's the second title?
The second title is the firstborn, that's 장자 or matul.
Firstborn. How is that different?
This title refers to the second god specifically in his status as a created being, a pijomo. It positions him as the preeminent one, the eldest among all creatures, or the chief among the adopted children of God.
So this isn't about his eternal nature, but about his status within creation.
Precisely. It's a title achieved, in a sense, through the act of incarnation and confirmed by the resurrection. Think of Colossians 1.15, the firstborn of all creation.
And Colossians 1.18, the firstborn from the dead, and Romans 8.29, becoming the firstborn among many brothers?
Yes, those texts link the title firstborn directly to his role within the created order and his relationship to other created beings. So the distinction is crucial. Only begotten speaks to his eternal divine essence as creator. Firstborn speaks to his assumed perfected status as creature.
Okay, only begotten, creator nature, firstborn, creature status. Got it. Now, the conflicting views. This is where the interpretations diverge, right? Based on these titles.
Exactly. The core disagreement revolves around when the title son, particularly only begotten son, actually originates or applies. Does it describe an eternal reality or one that began with creation? Let's look at the first perspective, which we can call viewpoint A, eternal sonship.
Eternal sonship. What's the argument here?
Viewpoint A holds that the Son is the Son eternally, that the relationship in the title only begotten Son existed in the infinite before any decision was made to enter creation.
So the father-son relationship is inherent to the Godhead, regardless of time or space.
Yes. The logic is that since the first and second gods shared glory in a relationship before the world existed, as suggested in John 17.5, then the titles reflecting that relationship must also be eternal.
So from this perspective, the second God was already the only begotten Son, the Creator, and he then entered space-time to add the status of firstborn creature.
Correct. The becoming firstborn is seen as taking on an additional role or function within the created order, not a change in his fundamental identity as the eternal Son.
What kind of scriptural support do the sources offer for this view? You mentioned John's 17.5.
Right, the pre-existent glory. They also point to texts like Proverbs 30.4, which asks about the creator of the earth, what is his name, and what is the name of his son, if you know. The implication being that the Son has an eternal name known alongside the Father's.
So the sonship existed, changed the troniad, even before creation.
That's the argument of viewpoint A. The relationship is eternal. The manifestation as firstborn in Hebrews 1.5 is seen as a functional shift within time, revealing the eternally existent Son in a new context.
Okay, that seems like a strong case based on the idea of eternal relationship and pre-existence. But what about the alternative? Viewpoint B, sonship through incarnation. How does this challenge the eternal identity?
Viewpoint B takes a perhaps more radically functional approach.
Good.
It argues that while the first God and second God eternally existed as distinct divine persons in the infinite, the specific titles Father and Son were not necessary or perhaps even meaningful in that purely eternal context before the plan of creation was put into action.
Oh, okay. So the distinction we understand, the father-son dynamic, with its implications of begetting, sending, relationship, that only came into play when the second God became a creature.
That's the core assertion of viewpoint B. The titles Father and Son are seen as arising specifically for the purpose of the creative and redemptive mission within space-time. They are roles defined by the job, essentially.
So according to this view, the second God became the only begotten Son, and subsequently the firstborn, because he entered the created order as a pijamol. The act of becoming a creature established the sonship.
Yes. It's a subtle but significant difference. It suggests the titles are contingent on the interaction with creation, necessary for the structure of inheritance, representation, and redemption.
But how does that square with the idea that they eternally sustain the infinite together? Doesn't eternal coexistence imply some kind of eternal relationship, even if we don't call it father-son?
That's the real tension viewpoint B has to navigate. It acknowledges the eternal coexistence and distinction between the divine persons, but it sees the titles Father and Son as, let's say, administrative or functional labels adopted for the specific project of creation.
So eternal distinction.
Yeah.
Yes. Eternal use of the titles Father and Son.
Oh.
Maybe not, according to this view. The titles are job descriptions for the space-time operation.
That's a way to put it. They emphasize the functional necessity of these roles within the created system, and they point to specific scriptures to support the idea that the sonship, in its manifested sense, has a starting point.
What texts do they use?
The key text often cited is Acts 13.33, which quotes Psalm 2.7 and says, "You are my son, this day have I begotten thee."
This day. That does sound like a specific point in time.
Viewpoint B interprets this day as referring to a specific event or context within space-time, perhaps the incarnation, perhaps the resurrection, when the Father publicly declared or established the second God in the role of Son within the created order. The begetting is linked to his entry into or victory within the created realm.
Okay, so let me see if I can summarize the difference. View A says, the second God was always the Son, only begotten creator, and he just put on the uniform of firstborn creature for the mission. His identity is eternal.
Right.
View B says, the second God, as a distinct eternal person, took on the role and title of Son, only begotten, when he became a creature, which then naturally led to the status of firstborn. The title is functional, tied to the mission.
That captures the essence of the distinction presented in the sources quite well. It's a profound theological debate about the relationship between eternal being and temporal role.
But regardless of which viewpoint you lean towards, whether the sonship is eternally essential or functionally adopted for creation,
both views agree that in space-time, during his mission, the second God holds both identities simultaneously. He is the only begotten creator. His inherent divine glory remains, as John 1:14 says, and he is the firstborn creature, his new status achieved through manifestation.
this dual identity is the key to understanding why he undertook this mission, why he had to voluntarily become smaller.
Exactly. It wasn't arbitrary. It leads us directly into a purpose behind the transformation, the kenosis. Why did the creator need to become a creature? The sources lay out some very specific reasons.
Okay, let's get into the why. What was the purpose of this self-emptying?
The sources highlight two primary interconnected goals. The first is about sovereignty, ownership, and inheritance within the created system.
Right, you mentioned this earlier. He needed to become the heir, the husa. But this still feels counterintuitive. If he created everything, doesn't he already own it? Why inherit?
It's a subtle but critical point about how God established the rules of his own creation. Yes, as the infinite creator, his ownership is absolute. But the sources suggest he chose to establish his rightful rule within the created order through a specific relational, almost legal mechanism, inheritance.
So it's about playing by the rules he himself set up for creation.
It seems so. Hebrews 1:2 says God appointed his son heir of all things, and also that it was through whom also he made the worlds. The creation and the inheritance plan seem linked from the start.
Okay, so the act of becoming the son, the heir, allows him to receive the kingdom, the inheritance, from the Father within the structure of space-time.
Exactly. It establishes his claim not just by raw power or original creation right, but through a legitimate relational transfer within the system. The sources refer to the parable of the vineyard owner sending his son, the heir, sang sakja in some related terms.
Luke 20, the wicked tenants. They recognize the son as the heir and want to kill him to take the inheritance.
Right. That parable highlights the concept of the son as the designated inheritor. By becoming the Son manifest as creature, the second God steps into that designated role to receive the inheritance, even though, in an ultimate sense, it was always his. He emptied himself to formally receive it.
So the legal structure of inheritance, of sonship leading to ownership, seems hardwired into the universe's design, according to these sources. And he fulfilled that design by becoming the son heir.
It validates the whole created structure of relationship and authority. It's not just about power, but about rightful relational authority established through the Son.
That makes sense of the first purpose, becoming the rightful heir within the created system. What's the second major purpose?
The second purpose shifts from the legal structure to the relational familial structure. And this is perhaps the more direct impact for humanity. The goal was to make others sons.
Okay. This connects back to the firstborn title.
Directly. The ultimate aim, according to the sources, is for the only begotten creator to become the firstborn creature.
So that other created beings, namely humankind, could be adopted, Yangja, into God's family, resembling the firstborn.
Romans 8:29 spells it out. God predestined believers to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers.
This is where the distinction between the titles becomes critical again. An only begotten son, by definition, doesn't have siblings in the same way.
Exactly. He is unique, one of a kind in his divine generation, but a firstborn can have younger brothers and sisters. By becoming the firstborn creature, he paved the way for adoption.
So his transformation fundamentally changes the potential relationship between God and humanity.
Completely. It shifts it from creator-creature, which can feel distant, to something much more intimate. The sources emphasize that by becoming a creature, the second God becomes our firstborn brother, Maxiang. We become adopted sons, Yangja, through him.
That changes everything. It introduces a familial structure, based on his sacrifice and representation.
And this familial connection established through the firstborn becomes the pathway for eternal life, young sighing for created beings.
How so?
1 John 5:1-12 is cited. And this is the testimony. God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God does not have life.
So by taking on the created status, living it perfectly, and overcoming its limitations, death, he became the source and conduit for eternal life for creatures.
Yes, he bridged the gap. He provided the means for time-bound, sinful creatures to connect to the eternal life of God through relationship with him as the firstborn.
The whole system seems designed for incorporating created beings into the divine family. But it required the pioneer, the firstborn, to actually achieve that status perfectly.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough just to show up as a creature.
Precisely. Just taking on the form wasn't the whole story. He had to live it, perfect it, and confirm that status through specific actions.
Which leads us to suffering, obedience, and resurrection. How did these confirm his status as the perfected firstborn?
The sources really focus on Hebrews, particularly chapter 5, verses 8-10. It says something quite staggering. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered.
Okay, this is one of the hardest parts to grasp. How does a perfect, divine, omniscient being learn obedience? Did he not know how to obey? Or does learn mean something else here?
It's a really profound statement. The sources clarify that it doesn't mean he was previously disobedient or lacked knowledge. He was inherently perfect, sinless. The learning here seems to be experiential.
Experiential, meaning he fully experienced what obedience felt like under the pressure of genuine human suffering and temptation.
Exactly. He didn't just know about obedience. He lived the actuality of obedience under the most extreme conditions possible for a created being. And through this suffering and perfect obedience, he was made complete or perfect.
Complete in what sense? He was already God.
Complete in his role as the source of eternal salvation. He fulfilled and perfected the requirements of the firstborn creature, the representative human. His suffering didn't add to his divinity, but it did complete his qualification for this specific redemptive role he undertook.
So the learning was about fulfilling the role, demonstrating perfect creaturely obedience under trial. He perfected the human response.
Yes. And this perfection through suffering was necessary to qualify him for another key title or role the sources highlight: the leader or captain or pioneer. The Greek word is archigos.
Archigos,
Oh.
the founder of salvation. Hebrews 2 talks about this, right? Making the captain of their salvation perfect through suffering.
Correct. Hebrews 2:1-12 explains that it was fitting for God, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the archigos of their salvation perfect through suffering.
What does being the archigos imply?
It implies he had to go first. He had to blaze the trail.
Yeah.
To lead humanity out of the trap of sin and death, he couldn't just point the way from outside. He had to enter the trap himself, navigate it perfectly, and forge the path out.
So he had to fully share our condition: temptation, suffering, mortality.
Yes. To be the perfect leader, the sources argue, he had to genuinely experience the full weight of human existence under the curse of sin, though remaining sinless himself. He had to face every temptation, every sorrow, every physical limit Adam's race faces.
So that he could truly represent us and overcome on our behalf from within our condition.
Exactly. The suffering, culminating in the cross, wasn't just a payment. It was the act that qualified him, that perfected him as the archigos. He couldn't have let us out if he hadn't gone through it himself.
Yeah.
His divinity sustained him, but his chosen creaturely status allowed him to undertake it.
Okay, so suffering and obedience perfected his role as the leader. Where does resurrection fit in? Why was that the ultimate confirmation?
Resurrection is presented as the pivotal event. It's the divine seal of approval, the ultimate vindication and confirmation of everything he accomplished in his creaturely state.
How does it relate to the titles?
This is where the sources bring the two titles into sharp focus. Before the resurrection, he was the only begotten son by nature, creator status. But the resurrection event officially recognized and publicly declared him as the perfected firstborn creature, 정가 피조물.
So resurrection didn't make him the son. He already was, in the only begotten sense. But it proved he was the successful, victorious firstborn, the one who conquered sin and death as a creature.
Precisely. He was confirmed or declared as the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by his resurrection from the dead, Romans 1:4. It was the ultimate proof of his sinless life and his victory over the limitations that bind other creatures.
The sources use the term buhol biung, or resurrection change. It's this change that demonstrated the victory.
Yes, that transformation from death to glorified life was the undeniable evidence that he had fulfilled the mission, overcome sin, and was indeed the worthy firstborn, the qualified archegos.
And the resurrection also confirmed another role, didn't it? One uniquely tied to his creaturely status.
Yes, the role of great high priest, Daejizajang.
Why is that tied to being a creature?
Because the concept of a priest, especially a high priest, in the Hebraic sense, required someone taken from among the people they represent. A priest offers sacrifices and intercedes for those he shares a nature with.
An infinite creator God doesn't need a priest and can't technically be one for creatures in the same way.
Right. By becoming a creature, Pijamol, by sharing our weaknesses, though without sin, and by suffering, the second God became qualified to be our merciful and faithful high priest. Hebrews 2.17, 4.15. Hebrews 5.7 explicitly says he was designated by God as high priest after the order of Melchizedek, linking it to his obedience and suffering.
So becoming the firstborn creature enabled him to be the firstborn brother, the archegos, and the great high priest. All roles necessary for redemption, all requiring the kenosis.
Exactly. The entire plan hinges on that voluntary acceptance of the creaturely state and its subsequent perfection.
And this template, this path of the firstborn suffering, obedience, resurrection, confirmation, sets the pattern for the rest of the family.
Yes. The adopted sons, the Yangja, now follow the path blazed by their firstborn brother. Romans 8.23 talks about believers groaning inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to be shown fully, which is the redemption of our bodies, our own resurrection change.
So our resurrection will be our official recognition, mirroring his.
That's the picture painted. We follow the firstborn into glory. The sources are clear, though. Adopted sons, Yangja, share in the glory of the firstborn, but they never attain the unique status of the only begotten son. That belongs to the second God alone in his divine nature. But we can be fully conformed to the image of the perfected firstborn creature.
Okay, this brings us full circle back to the original paradox. We now understand why the second God might have voluntarily become a creature and thus functionally smaller. It was necessary for the entire creative and redemptive plan to be heir, firstborn, archegos, high priest.
Right. The temporary subordination wasn't arbitrary. It served these incredibly specific and profound purposes within the framework of space-time.
So when the second God in the gospel says things like, "The Father is greater than I," John 14.28.
He is speaking from within that voluntarily assumed role, from the perspective of the manifested Son operating under the functional authority of the first God within the creative mission.
And when he refers to the first God as my God, like after the resurrection in John 20.17, Me Hanem.
Same principle. It's the language of the perfected creature, the firstborn son, acknowledging the ultimate authority of the first God who sent him and orchestrated the plan. It reflects the organizational hierarchy established specifically for this mission in space-time.
It's not a statement about his eternal nature, but about his current operational context.
Exactly. If you only consider them in the eternal infinite, where they are co-equal, the first God giving the second God commands, like in John 10.18 about laying down his life, or entrusting all judgment to him, John 5.22, wouldn't make sense in the same way.
The command structure relies on the voluntary subordination he accepted.
Yes. The kenosis creates the context where sending, commanding, obeying, and judging through the Son becomes the operational reality for accomplishing the salvation of creation.
This understanding must also shed light on the cry from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? How does the creator-creature distinction play into that moment?
The sources argue this is perhaps the starkest demonstration of the necessity of that distinction. The feeling of abandonment, the temporary rupture in perceived fellowship.
Could only happen because the second God was operating as the firstborn creature bearing the sin of the world.
Precisely. The sources assert that the infinite creator cannot be cut off from the infinite creator. They are eternally united in sustaining the infinite. Therefore, the one who cries out in dereliction is the created Son in his substitutionary role, experiencing the separation from God that sin causes.
So the only begotten creator remains eternally united with the first God, but the firstborn creature, in that moment of atonement, experiences the forsakenness. The titles are essential to even articulate this mystery.
It seems so. If the father-son relationship was only an eternal, immutable state with no functional distinction based on the kenosis, that cry of abandonment becomes almost conceptually impossible within the framework provided. The temporary creaturely status allows for this unique, horrifying, and ultimately redemptive moment.
It's the ultimate consequence, the deepest point of the self-emptying.
The lowest point of the subordination undertaken voluntarily for the highest purpose.
Which is, what's the grand finale of this whole cosmic plan, according to the sources? Where does this temporary subordination lead?
It leads back to equality, but only after the mission is fully accomplished. The key passage here is 1 Corinthians 15:28.
Okay, 1 Corinthians 15. Paul's talking about the resurrection and the end of all things.
Right. He outlines a sequence. The first God sent the Son, the second God, into the world. The Son's mission is to bring all things in creation into subjection under his feet, to defeat sin, death, and rebellion.
So a process of restoration and establishing rightful authority.
Yes. And when this is finally complete, when every enemy is defeated and all of creation willingly submits to the Son, then comes the final step.
Which is?
The Son himself, who has brought everything under his authority as the firstborn heir, will then voluntarily submit himself to the one who put all things under him, that is, to the first God.
The Son submits to the Father at the very end. Why?
The stated purpose is so that God, the first God, may be all in all. The phrase used in the source's reference is manui jurosio manu and egisirio hashemira, essentially, that the first God might be Lord of all, dwelling in all.
It sounds like the successful completion and handing over of the project. The second God, as the agent of creation and redemption, presents the perfected creation back to the ultimate source, the first God.
That's a good way to visualize it. It's the ultimate restoration of order and purpose, with the first God's intended reign fully established throughout the redeemed creation, mediated through the Son's completed work.
Yeah, what happens to the Son's status after this final submission? Does he remain subordinate?
This is the crucial culmination. The sources explicitly state that once this mission within space-time is fully accomplished, the second God, who voluntarily became smaller for the task, will again become equal to the first God.
Back to full, manifest equality.
Yes. The temporary functional subordination required by the creative redemptive mission dissolves, and the eternal inherent equality is fully restored or revealed.
Although, the sources add a nuance here, don't they? About perspective.
They do. It's noted that this description, the sequence of submission and return to equality, is framed from the perspective of a created being thinking within the flow of time. Meaning it describes the unfolding of the plan as we perceive it. It might imply that, from God's eternal perspective outside of time, the equality was never truly broken in essence, only veiled or expressed differently during the phase of the Son's mission as a creature. The return to equality is the manifestation of that eternal truth at the end of the temporal process.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot to take in. So let's try to synthesize this. What's the big picture the sources leave us with?
We're left with this incredibly complex, dynamic picture of the second God. He exists simultaneously, depending on the context, as the eternally divine, only begotten creator.
Inherently equal to the first God, sustaining the infinite.
And as the self-sacrificing firstborn creature who voluntarily became smaller, suffered, obeyed, died, and rose again to perfect the created role.
And these two titles, only begotten and firstborn, they aren't interchangeable.
Definitely not. They describe two different states or roles of the same divine person. Only begotten relates to his eternal nature in the infinite. Firstborn relates to his achieved status and function within space-time.
And this duality, this paradox of being both at once was absolutely necessary.
According to these sources, yes. It was the necessary mechanism to bridge the gap between the infinite God and finite creation, to establish rightful inheritance, to defeat sin and death from within, and ultimately to enable the adoption of creatures like us into God's family.
The entire structure of salvation, becoming the heir, the brother, the leader, Archegos, the high priest, Dejazajan, it all flows from that initial voluntary step of kenosis, of becoming the pishomol, the creature.
He chose to become temporarily smaller so that created beings could be lifted up, made sons and daughters, and share in eternal life. It's a plan defined by both incredible cosmic structure and profound sacrificial love.
It really is. And it leaves us with that final, really provocative thought you mentioned earlier, stemming from viewpoint B.
Ah, yes, the question about whether the roles could have been reversed.
If the father-son distinction is primarily functional, arising from the needs of the creative mission within space-time,
then the sources implicitly raise the question. If the first God, rather than the second, had been the one to empty himself and become the creature,
would the roles have been flipped? Would the first God have become the Son for the mission and the second God the Father who sends?
It's a mind-bending hypothetical. Does the very nature of creation, the need for incarnation, suffering, inheritance, priesthood, does that inherently dictate which divine person must fulfill the role we call son?
In other words, is the Son role defined by the demands of the universe? He came to save, rather than just being an arbitrary assignment.
That's the question the material seems to leave hanging in the air. It pushes us to think about the deep relationship between the nature of God and the nature of the reality he chose to create. A truly infinite question to ponder.
Indeed, an infinitely profound place to pause. Thank you for navigating us through that incredibly dense, but ultimately illuminating deep dive into the paradox of the Son.
It's always fascinating to explore these foundational concepts. A pleasure as always.